is Sean Orr. I'm from Milwaukee originally, recent transplant to Chicago. I'm a proud Teamster and a proud member of Freedom Road Socialist Organization. I'm going to talk a little bit about the context behind why the United States is so interested in Venezuela at the current moment.
Donald Trump is opening the door to a Syria-like intervention in the heart of South America. Freedom Road Socialist Organization stands shoulder to shoulder with the Venezuelan masses and their elected president, Nicolas Maduro, against the attacks and threats of the U.S. and its allies. We call on progressive and popular forces of the United States to organize against the Trump government and to do everything possible to stand with the people of Venezuela against U.S. intervention.
And they always conjure up some skewed version of events to try and trick some of us to divide us as a class. So we are not surprised to see Venezuela is divided. And as Marxists, we try to understand these divisions in a systematic way to deepen our practical understanding of how we do the work of bringing about a more equal and just society. Sean unapologetically takes the position of the working class. And he does this not as some abstract thought experiment, but seeks out the actual existing protracted struggles of the Venezuelan workers, the campesinos, and their grassroots organizations.
So the United States is currently in a state of war with Venezuela. And while this war has not yet extended to the bullet and the bomb, it is being carried out every day against the Venezuelan people through an economic war, an economic and financial blockade, and with the support to an anti-democratic, far-right opposition movement that uses violence to terrorize the people. And while the U.S. monopoly capitalist class has struggled against the Bolivarian Revolution since it began in 1999, this conflict became a sustained one after the failed coup in 2002 and intensified with the election of Nicolas Maduro as president in 2013. So my question for today is why? Why does it matter to the monopoly capitalists, to Wall Street, to the White House? Why does it matter to them what happens in Venezuela? Why is it that in 2015, President Obama declared Venezuela to be, quote, a threat to the national security of the United States and began the campaign of sanctions that has only intensified since then? And so I argue in this talk and in my work that there's two sort of fundamental reasons why Venezuela is viewed as such a threat. One of them is one that's well known to all of us, that's well known to the world. The other one is something that we haven't seen for some time, but we will probably be seeing more of in the coming period. Since the end of the Cold War, U.S. imperialism's main strategic objective in the world has shifted from defeating socialism to subjugating any nation that seeks to determine its own future. We saw this in the 90s with the first war in Iraq, the destruction of the state of Yugoslavia, the bombings of Sudan and Somalia, and of course we saw this kicked into high gear with the invasions and occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq, the destruction of Libya, and the ongoing wars in Syria and Yemen. Every nation targeted was not one advocating socialist revolution. They just wanted to develop themselves according to their own interests. Yet, unfortunately, only submission is acceptable to the U.S. empire right now and is willing to commit any atrocity to ensure that that happens around the world. In function, Venezuela was no different from coffee-producing El Salvador, sugar-producing Cuba, or copper-producing Chile. The economy served the interests of the United States and not its own people. So therefore, it's not understand why the Venezuelan masses rose up, rallied behind Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian movement, and swept him into office in 1998. They demanded a government that worked for them, not one that tried to appease them while working for foreign interests. And when Chavez entered the presidential palace in 1998, Venezuela was at the time one of the most unequal countries on the continent, well in running to be one of the most unequal in the world. And by the time he passed away, it was the most equal country in Latin America. Now, emboldened by this crisis that they helped to create, the bourgeois opposition went on the offensive against Maduro from day one. It must be understood that the Maduro government has not known a single day of peace, a single day of having to deal with an opposition that was not trying to undemocratically tear them down by any means available. The night that Maduro won his first term, his opponent Enrique Capriles called on his supporters to, quote, unleash their fury in the streets. Days of violence ensued. Community health clinics were firebombed. The Cuban embassy was besieged. And when the smoke cleared, 11 Bolivarian activists had been murdered. This was week one of the Maduro presidency. And the opposition has not given him, nor the people that support him, a moment of peace since then. In 2015, Obama declared Venezuela to be, quote, a threat to the national security of the country and announced sanctions against several top government officials. An immediate effect of this announcement was the en masse withdrawal of U.S. capital from Venezuela. Within a year, U.S. multinational firms like Ford, Kimberly-Clark, General Motors, and Kellogg's had shuttered their operations in the country, putting thousands of jobs at threat and hampering the country's efforts to recover their own economy. And the sanctions and those that followed were incredibly harmful to the Venezuelan currency, which is already in a tailspin because of this economic crisis. This creates the hyperinflation that we hear so often about in the US media, which thankfully, and of course will not be reported, has leveled off in the past 6 months. For the past 20 years, the country has been led by a mass movement, a national liberation movement, the Bolivarian movement, which is committed to sovereignty and independence from imperialism. And at every crossroad, in the face of every obstacle and threat, it has chosen the path of further independence, of greater sovereignty. The dogged commitment of the Venezuelan people to their own interests must be an incredible source of frustration in Wall Street and in the White House. Now, the second reason that I argue in my work that Venezuela is a threat to U.S. interests is an economic one as well. But it goes beyond the contradiction of imperialism and the oppressed nations, which is our dominant one in the world today. In Venezuela, within the movement, the Bolivarian movement that leads that nation, there is a goal, the goal of building a new socialist society. While that day is not yet here, it is within reach, and it terrifies the monopoly capitalists of the United States to their very core. Now, from the beginning, the Bolivarian movement has been a multi-class one. It's made up of the many classes and sectors of society whose interests just do not lie with imperialist interests in the country. Now, this, of course, includes the working class, which is by far the largest class in the country. It also includes the small campesino class, small and medium-sized farmers, progressives in the military, radical sectors of the petty bourgeoisie, and even elements of the bourgeoisie. Now, some of these forces have no material interest in socialism. They only desire those reforms that will assuage the masses and isolate the sellout large capitalists, enabling them to consume more of the profit. However, the Venezuelan working class not only has a material interest in socialism, but it's advancing to get there with such determination that it sometimes pulls tight on the reins of a national government that's trying to balance the interests of all forces within the movement at once. Now, this class militancy did not come out of nowhere. It's a product of decades of struggle, of the guerrilla war, of factory occupations, of urban uprising, militant strikes, and it's also the result of the development of revolutionary organization and the spread of revolutionary consciousness among the population as a whole over those decades. Now, this can be measured not just in the broad popularity that these revolutionary groups now have in the elections and in terms of membership. After all, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, in terms of a percentage of the population, is the largest party in South America. It has 7 million members in a country of 30 million people, which is that's nothing to spit at, that's for sure. Today, because of the workers and because of their militancy and their desire to build a socialist society, nearly every heavy industry in the country is either state-owned directly or it's run by a worker council. And experiments in working class control of production is underway in many of the state-owned companies as well. If the Venezuelan nation has not yet collapsed from the weight of the economic crisis and hyperinflation, it is thanks to the millions of women and men that despite every hardship go out every morning and earn a living selling their labor power. Now, Maduro and his government are not ignorant of the working class. Many of them, Maduro included, are workers themselves, proud of it, militants in the labor movement that fought for decades to get to the present moment where they are in. Now, in October, a few months ago, another historic gathering took place to try to figure out this question of how do we get to socialism. This was the Constituent Congress of the Working Class. It was led by the trade unions, chaired by the country's labor minister and by President Maduro himself, and it was a month-long process of workers' assemblies across the country. They determined that for the Plan de la Patria to succeed, for a new economy to be built, a, quote, model of socialist companies must be established in the country. Workers must control the means of production. This was the demand from the working class themselves. The government and the workers, now organized through the labor ministry, the unions, the CPTs, and the militias, have begun this process, this revolutionary process in the state sector. The oil refineries, steel mills, and aluminum and iron manufacturers that all belong to the state are now currently in the process of coming under direct worker control. And this is because of the support that Maduro and the government has for the revolutionary working class. Venezuela still remains within the confines of capitalist social relations. Swaths of the economy are state-owned, yes. One estimate I saw was 1/3 of all production is run by the state at this moment. And workers are organized into communes, into the CPTs, the productive council, the workers' councils. And they continue to organize. New ones are formed every day, taking control of this factory or that workplace, ensuring that the new economy will work in their interests and not imperialism's. But despite all this, the bourgeoisie still remains, and its claws are dug deep, particularly in the service and distribution sectors. Now, this is why when they talk about the economic war, they talk about it on the grocery shelves, because that is where the bourgeoisie has its firmest grip. And so long as the bourgeoisie holds economic power of that kind, of any kind, in Venezuela, socialism cannot succeed. Now, it is in this context of a threat to the economic interests of the United States and an existential threat to imperialism that we must view the events that have happened since May 2018, when Maduro was reelected in a landslide. Trump and his cronies cannot tolerate another moment, another minute of an independent Venezuela, especially one where socialism seems like it might be on the horizon. Democratic means is no longer on the table for the imperialists. Now is the time of combat for them, and they intend to make the Venezuelan people suffer for their willingness to stand tall, for their courage in the face of all obstacles, and for the hope they give to peoples across the world, including to us right here in this room, and to all those in the people's movements of the United States, who are struggling to shake the monopoly capitalists off our backs and to bring about a new world. Thank you all.